The Muslim Community, Faith and Politics.
For many who have observed the development of Islam, particularly in early Islamic history, they are struck by the extent to which the Prophet Muhammad was both a prophet and a statesman. And in earlier lessons, we've explored the initial relationship of religion to state and society, certainly as it became articulated within the first community at Medina. Today, we'll look at the development of faith and politics throughout history, down to the contemporary period. The history of Islam demonstrates the extent to which religion is integrally related to politics and society. Faith, power, civilization, and culture are intertwined. The development of Islam from the period of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, the first four successors following Muhammad, to the development of early Islamic empires, first the Umayyad from 661 to 750, and then the Abbasid from 750 to 1258. These empires reveal the remarkable achievements that culminated in what some call the golden age of Islamic civilization. They also help us to understand the sources of sectarianism, religious extremism, and conflict between Islam and Christianity, epitomized by the Crusades. Many of these have an influence on today's realities as well. The relationship of religion to a political order begins with the birth and the spread of Muhammad's original community, his community state at Medina. Within a century after Muhammad's death, Islam as a faith and as an Islamic empire stretched from North Africa to South Asia. Islam informed state institutions, including the caliphate, notions of citizenship, war and peace, law, taxation, education, and social services. Previously, we discussed that first Islamic community under Muhammad. The development of the caliphate began with the traumatic event, though, of Muhammad's death in 632, marking the end of direct guidance from the Prophet. The period of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs. The rightly guided caliphs, the first four ruled from 632 to 661, is regarded as the normative period of Sunni Islam and provides the ideal path to which Muslims look for inspiration and guidance today. The rightly guided caliphs were the first four successors to Muhammad. All of them were Muhammad's companions and were chosen by a process of consultation. Today we hear the words Sunni and Shi'i Muslims, the two major branches of the community. Sunni comprise 85% of the world's Muslims, and Shi'i approximately 15%. The division stems from an early disagreement and conflict over who should lead the community. The majority of Muslims, who came to be called Sunni or Sunnis, followers of the Sunnah example of the Prophet, selected Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close companion and trusted advisor, to be caliph, the successor, but his successor as political leader, not as prophet, political leader of the community. Sunni Muslims adopted the belief that leadership should pass to the most qualified person, not through hereditary succession. As caliph, Abu Bakr became the political and military leader of the community. Although he was not a prophet, the Quran had declared Muhammad to be the last of the prophets. The caliph had religious prestige as head of the community of believers, the Ummah. Now, a minority of the Muslim community, who would later come to be called Shi'i, or the party of Ali, opposed the selection of Abu Bakr as caliph, believing that succession should be hereditary, staying within the Prophet's family. Thus, they maintained that Ali, Muhammad's closest living male relative, should be the leader, imam, of the Islamic community. Ali was Muhammad's first cousin, the husband to Muhammad's daughter Fatima. She believed that the imam, although not a prophet, is divinely inspired, sinless, and infallible. Consequently, in contrast to the Sunni caliph, for Shi'i, the imam is both a religious and a political leader, and serves as the final authoritative interpreter of God's will, as formulated in Islamic law. However, the majority, the Sunni opinion, prevailed. Ali was passed over for the position of caliph 3 times. Finally gaining his place after 35 years, he was assassinated only a few years later. At his death, Muawiyah, a general and governor of Damascus, who had challenged Ali's leadership, asserted his power and established the Umayyad dynasty. Ali's followers remained disaffected. Shi'i opposition to Umayyad rule came to a head in 680, when Ali's son and Muhammad's grandson Hussein led a rebellion in an attempt to recover the leadership of the Muslim community. When popular support failed to materialize, Hussein and his followers were slaughtered by the overwhelming forces of the Umayyad army at Karbala in modern-day Iraq. The memory of this tragedy, called the martyrdom of Hussein, created a paradigm of suffering and protest that has guided and inspired Shi'i ever since. Thus, the martyrdom of Hussein proved an effective symbol for protest and mobilization during the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, as well as the Iran-Iraq War and the Lebanese Civil War. Although Sunni and Shi'i share many fundamental beliefs and practices, their differences regarding who should succeed Muhammad and lead the community, and their struggles for power resulted in contrasting views of the meaning of history. The Sunni majority remembers a golden age of faith and empire, marked by Islam's spread and expansion globally as a faith, world power, and civilization. Thus, success, power, and wealth are seen as evidence of God's favor and historic validation of Islam. The Shi'i minority, on the other hand, who failed in their opposition to Sunni hegemony, saw themselves as victims of the illegitimate usurpation of power by Sunni rulers at the expense of a just society. For Shi'i, history serves as the theater for the struggle of an oppressed and disinherited minority community to restore God's rule on earth over the entire Muslim community under the leadership of the Imam. Realization of this just social order remained a frustrated hope and expectation for Shi'i across the centuries. In time, though, Shi'i did enjoy political power, creating the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, which reigned from 909 to 1171, and the Safavid Empire in Iran from 1501 to 1722, and indeed the Shi'i remained as the dominant religion down to today in Iran. Shi'i branches had come to exist within decades after the creation of Shi'ism. Over time, disagreement within the community over succession led to three major divisions within Shi'ism itself, depending on how many imams or leaders each community recognized. The three divisions are the Fivers, also known as the Zaydis, the Seveners, represented today in large part by the Ismailis, who are followers of the Aga Khan, and the Twelvers, also known as the Ithna Asharis. The Twelvers are the most populous of the Shi'i. They're found as the overwhelming majority in Iran, where it remains the official religion, but also in countries like Iraq, Bahrain, and elsewhere. Shi'i believe that the last Imam went into hiding or occultation, creating the doctrine of the hidden Imam. The hidden Imam is expected to return as a Mahdi, a messianic figure, who will come at the end of time to restore the community to its rightful place and usher in a perfect Islamic society in which truth and justice will prevail. During the hidden Imam's absence, the community is to be guided by religious experts capable of interpreting Islamic law, so-called mujtahids. The most striking aspect of the early expansion of Islam and of early Islamic history was the rapidity and the success of this political expansion. Within 100 years after the death of the Prophet, Muslim empire and rule extended from North Africa to South Asia, an empire greater than Rome at her zenith. For many believers, it was proof of God's guidance and reward for their faithfulness. The Muslim expansion was marked by building, adoption, and adaptation of existing political institutions and sciences, rather than destruction, motivated by religious fervor, but also the desire for economic rewards of conquest, plunder, booty. Although the indigenous rulers and armies of conquered countries were replaced, much of their government and bureaucracy and culture were preserved. The inhabitants of newly conquered areas were given three options. One could convert to Islam, become protected, a dhimmi minority, protected people able to practice their religion, and be protected from other invaders in exchange for payment of a head tax or poll tax. Or, if one chose to resist, then battle or the sword. Muslim rule often proved to be more flexible and tolerant than that of rule under the Byzantine or Persian empires. And so, some Christian communities, in fact, did convert. There was broader tolerance, and often the tax system was far less than under Christian rule. These early conquests sought primarily to extend Muslim rule, to gain territory and tax revenue, rather than to gain converts to Islam. Religious minorities were able to exist, as I said earlier, and practice their faith. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, Islam and Muslim political power then expanded exponentially under the Umayyads and subsequently the Abbasid caliphates. The Umayyad dynasty, which reigned from 661 to 750, ended what later generations would call the golden age of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, and turned the caliphate into a hereditary monarchy dominated by an Arab military aristocracy. Centered in Damascus, the Umayyads completed the conquest of the Persian and Byzantine empires. The Umayyads were successful in acquiring power and wealth, symbolized by the lifestyle of the flourishing cosmopolitan capital in Damascus. Remember now the movement from Medina to Damascus, and the growth of new cities. They established a strong, centralized, dynastic kingdom and empire. Although they used Islam to legitimate and rationalize their conquest, the Umayyads adopted and adapted the advanced government, institutions, and bureaucracy of the Byzantine Empire. The Umayyads met, though, with considerable opposition. Their new dynastic ambitions, imperial court, lifestyle, and materialism were considered by their critics to be innovations that undermine the older, pristine Arab Islamic way of life of the Prophet and the early community at Medina. Their strengths sowed the seeds of dissent and violence. One early opposition group was a splinter group, the Kharijites, those who secede or leave, the earliest example of radical dissent in Islam. The worldview of the Kharijites, who combined a rigorous Puritanism with a militant religious fundamentalism and exclusivism, continued to inform contemporary religious extremist groups, from the assassins of Egypt's former president Anwar Sadat to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda today. They believed in literal and absolute interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, regarding anyone who deviated from their interpretation of Islam, a non-believer, subject, therefore, to excommunication, warfare, and death. And we'll see later, this is precisely the position that Osama takes. The Shi'i were another opposition group, the followers of Ali. They also opposed the Umayyads because of their refusal to submit to Ali's authority and their illegitimate usurpation of the caliphate. In the 1970s, Shi'i would liken the Shah of Iran's authoritarian rule to that of Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyads. And it was Yazid's army, remember, that defeated Hussein at Karbala in that slaughter that came to be remembered as the martyrdom. The Umayyad dynasty came to an end, though, in 750, after a revolt that led to the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate. Under the Abbasids, who ruled from 750 to 1258, with their new capital in Baghdad, modern-day Iraq, the Islamic community peaked as an empire of wealth, political power, and cultural accomplishments. The Abbasid Caliphate ushered in an era of strong centralized government, at least in its early centuries, great economic prosperity, and a remarkable civilization. Jews and Christians, as well as Muslims, served in the Abbasid bureaucracy. Abbasid success was based upon trade, commerce, industry, and agriculture, rather than conquest. The Abbasids aligned their government with Islam and became patrons of the emerging class, this new class of ulama, religious scholars, supporting the development of Islamic scholarship and disciplines and building mosques and schools or madrasas. Enormous wealth enabled the Abbasid caliphs to become great patrons of art and architecture, culture, resulting in the florescence of Islamic civilization. Great urban cultural centers were founded in Cordoba, modern-day Spain, Baghdad, Iraq, Cairo, Egypt, Nishapur, Iran, and Palermo, Italy, eclipsing Christian Europe. From the 7th to the 9th centuries, manuscripts were obtained from the far reaches of the empire and translated from Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Persian into Arabic. The best works of philosophy, science, and literature from other cultures were appropriated, such as Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Hippocrates, Euclid, Ptolemy. Now, two myths pervade in terms of popular Western perceptions of the Crusades. First, that the Crusades were simply motivated by a religious desire to liberate Jerusalem, and second, that Christendom ultimately triumphed. The contrast between these myths and reality can be seen in the following. And admittedly here I'm being selective, but it's to address this kind of contrast. After Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in 638, both Christians and Jews were allowed to live in and make pilgrimages to Jerusalem under Muslim rule. This peaceful coexistence lasted for 500 years. The Crusades were the result of a combination of political events and an imperial papal power play in which Christendom was pitted against Islam, leaving a legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. The Crusades were called for by Pope Urban II, following the defeat of the Byzantine army by the Abbasids. The Byzantine emperor responded by calling upon fellow Christian rulers for help and called upon the Pope to come to the aid of Christianity to free Jerusalem and its environs from the Muslims. The Pope saw an opportunity to gain recognition for papal authority and its role in legitimating the action of temporal rulers, of emperors. Christian rulers, knights, and merchants participated, not only out of piety, and many did out of piety, but also due to political and military ambitions and the promise of economic and commercial, trade and banking rewards that were expected to accompany the establishment of a Latin kingdom in the Middle East. The appeal to religion captured the popular mind and support of many Christians who responded enthusiastically to its battle cry, "God wills it." As with all wars, both sides had their heroes and villains. In recent years, the Crusades have often been portrayed as the defense of Christianity against barbaric Muslim warriors. The overly romanticized image in the West sharply contrasts with Muslim memories as well as the record of history. When the Christian Crusaders stormed Jerusalem and established Christian sovereignty over the Holy Land in 1099, they left neither Muslim nor Jewish survivors. Women and children were massacred, and Jerusalem's holy sites were desecrated. By contrast, the Muslim army, led by Saladin, recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. The Muslim army spared civilians and left churches and shrines largely untouched. Saladin was faithful to his word and compassionate towards non-combatants. Muslim memories of Christian heroes like Richard the Lionhearted are decidedly more negative than in the West. Having accepted the surrender of Acre, Richard proceeded to slaughter all of its inhabitants, including women and children, despite his promises to the contrary. The Crusades ended in 1453, when Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, fell to the Turks and was renamed Istanbul, the seat of the Ottoman Empire. Now let us shift to the Sultanate period. The Abbasid Empire, its caliphate, fell in 1258, overrun by the Mongols. However, within a short period of time, it was replaced by a string of smaller Muslim states or governments called sultanates. They extended from Senegal in Africa to the Philippines in Southeast Asia, as Islam penetrated Africa, Central and Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe, largely through missionary work of traders and Sufi brotherhoods. Traders and Sufi brotherhoods. 3 imperial sultanates emerged. The Turkish Ottoman Empire from 1281 to 1924, the Persian Safavid Empire from 1501 to 1722, and the Indian Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent, 1520 to 1857, all of which experienced political power and a cultural florescence. All of the imperial sultanates demonstrated a common outlook and approach to state organization, support, and use of Islam, although they were different in many other ways. The rulers were generally called Sultan, the one with power, or in Iran, Shah, king. Rule was based upon a combination of military strength and religious legitimacy. The ruler served, for example, as the protector and defender of the faith. Islamic law was the official law of the state, even though rulers might also make their own regulations or laws in addition to that. Religion both supported and was supported by the state. The ulama played an important role in the state, assisting in the centralization and control of the educational, legal, and social systems, educating the military, the bureaucracy, and religious elites. They supervised and guided the application and interpretation of Islamic law and oversaw the disbursement of funds from religious endowments called waqf or waqfs for educational and social services. The imperial sultanates peaked in the 16th century. By the turn of the 18th century, their power and prosperity were in serious decline. This decline coincided with the Industrial Revolution and modernization in the West, leading to the era of European colonialism and its profound impact on Islam and the Muslim world, as we shall see later in this course. Now, it's very important to think about what was happening and what the results were and their impact on, if you will, both Muslim history and the Muslim psyche. Islam had begun, remember, in Arabia, in an area torn by tribal strife, an area with tremendous division, an area that was positioned between two empires that were fighting each other and squeezing the center, as it were. The Prophet Muhammad somehow comes and, in the mind of most Muslims, in a very ingenious way, guided by God, unites Arabia and creates a prophet-led religio-political state existing under the banner of Islam. In subsequent centuries, we see the expansion of Islam, as a religion becoming global, and we've discussed that today, but also that Islam is part of the state. And so we can talk about imperial Islam, the creation of the Umayyad Empire, the Abbasid Empire, and then even when the Mongols overran the Abbasids and it looked like this was a major turn in history, the reemergence of Islam, not only as faith, but again, as state and empire, with this vast set of sultanates from literally Timbuktu in Africa to Mindanao in Southeast Asia. Despite the ups and downs of history, with its record of failure and success, Islamic history is generally remembered by many Muslims as a time in which Islam then spread as both faith and empire. Thus, from the time of the Prophet, the 7th century, to European imperialism, roughly the 18th century, to be a Muslim was to live in a Muslim society and belong to a transnational community. And, in a sense, to have a sense of belonging to, in a sense, a kind of interconnected transnational empire. One could feel as a Muslim that you were traveling, protected, as it were, under Muslim rule from one part of the world to the next, and many did that. This vision and ideal has been challenged in recent centuries by the decline of Muslim fortunes and the subordination of much of the Muslim world to outside powers. From European colonialism, and one does not want to underestimate that impact, from European colonialism and the Cold War, the superpower rivalry, to the powerful influence of America and the West today. Muslims have struggled and continue to struggle with these formidable challenges to their faith and governance. And this will continue to be seen throughout the rest of the course. We are going to shortly look at the playing out of Islam in modern history and how the impact of the West becomes a dominant theme from the 18th century down to today. A dominant theme affecting Muslim perceptions of the West and affecting relationships between the Muslim world and the West. But before we do that, we want to turn and take a look at the development of two institutions, Islamic law and Sufism. As it were, we want to look at the two major, if you will, paths that Muslims chose to define and pursue as they sought to follow the Quranically mandated straight path of Islam.
Paths to God. Islamic law and mysticism.
The rapid expansion of Islam brought the rise of new centers of power and wealth, as we saw last class, an influx of foreign ways and greater social stratification. The contrast between the idealized community of the Prophet and the realities of Umayyad life, dissatisfaction with abuses of power and corruption, gave rise not only to revolutionary groups like the Kharijites, whom we discussed last class, but also to two major non-revolutionary reform movements or institutions, Islamic law and Sufism, or Islamic mysticism. Historically, from the 7th to the 10th centuries, Muslim scholars formulated Islamic law. Many of the earliest scholars were in fact pious Muslims who had their jobs, their day jobs as it were, as merchants and traders, but also were serious students of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. It would only be later that they would develop into a separate professional class, the ulama, literally the learned ones, the religious scholars. These early scholars developed the science of law or jurisprudence, fiqh, meaning understanding. Understanding in order to ascertain, interpret, and apply God's guidance, the Sharia, as found in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, the example of the Prophet. Based then upon both divinely revealed prescriptions, the Quran, an example of the Prophet, and their own human interpretation, they attempted to delineate a comprehensive blueprint for Muslim life and society, what we often refer to as Islamic law or Sharia. Islamic law then was a response to real religious, political, and social concerns and issues. Piety and politics were intertwined. Those who turned to law during the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th and 9th centuries did so to limit the autonomy and power of rulers by standardizing the law and taking its control out of the hands of the caliph or his appointed judges. So they both wanted to delineate what it meant to be a good Muslim as well as limit the power of rulers. Centers or schools of thought sprang up in Medina, in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Kufa, and in Basra, across the then existing Muslim world. While many schools were established, 4 schools came to be the major Sunni law schools: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali law schools. And these have endured to modern times. Based then both upon revelation and human interpretation, which is called ijtihad, a very central concept which we'll talk about a lot during the course, scholars attempted to delineate a comprehensive blueprint for Muslim life and society, what it meant to be a good Muslim. Although there was general agreement on many matters, significant differences also existed, reflecting differences of interpretation, as well as the diverse geographic, social, and cultural context in which the jurists were writing. It made a difference whether you lived in a more conservative or, if you will, a more open society. The development of law flourished in particular during the 10th century under the Abbasid dynasty. Remember that the Abbasids enjoyed great wealth and became patrons of religious leaders of the sciences and the arts. The Abbasid caliphs, having led a rebellion that overthrew the Umayyads, sought to justify their revolution and legitimate their rule in the name of Islam, and so became the patrons of Islam. The study of Islamic sources and the development of Islamic studies in the Quran, the prophetic traditions or hadith, and law excelled in the hands of a new class of scholars. And here we see this class emerge. The ulama take their name from alim, the Arabic singular, which means a learned one. The ulama are the learned ones. They become, as it were, a religious class. Islamic law developed then as the ideal social blueprint for the believer, responding to the question, what should I do? If I am to be a Muslim and realize God's will, well, what does that mean concretely? How should I live my life? Islamic law springs from the basic meaning and requirement of Islam, submission to, and realization of God's will. The Quran, remember, teaches that Muslims must strive or struggle, jihad, in the path, Sharia, in the path of God, to implement God's will on earth, expand and defend their community, and establish a just society. Like Judaism, and in contrast to Christianity's emphasis on doctrine, on correct belief, on orthodoxy, Islam emphasizes correct action, observance, or orthopraxy. Thus, in Islam, as in Judaism, law rather than theology enjoys pride of place as the central expression of the faith. One defines oneself in terms of whether one is an observant Muslim, just as one talks about an observant Jew. In Christianity, the tendency was to tilt towards doctrine. Though they overlap, the distinction between Sharia, God's law, and fiqh, human understanding and interpretation of law, is critical to understanding the meaning and dynamic nature of Islamic law and its possibilities for modern reinterpretation and reform today. Many say, is Islam and is Islamic law capable of change and reform? Well, we'll see the importance of these terms. Sharia in the Quran and in Islam refers specifically to divine law, for God is the only lawgiver. Islamic law, in many ways, is a broader category that encompasses the divine law and human understanding or interpretation, fiqh. And so it's an interpretation of God's law. Too often, though, Sharia is simply equated with the term Islamic law, obscuring the degree to which human interpretation influenced the final product, so that the final product is actually a combination of that which is immutable and that which is mutable or changeable due to human interpretation. The development of Islamic law was the work then of religious scholars, the ulama, rather than judges, courts, or governments. They primarily laid out the law that we find in the law books. The main divisions of law concern two broad areas. First, a Muslim's duties to God. Obligatory practices or essential observances. Here primarily those involved with worship. Think concretely of the 5 pillars of Islam. These are unchangeable. Second, a Muslim's duties to others, social transactions or relations. These would include regulations governing public life, from contract and international law to family laws governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Sunni Muslims recognize 4 official sources of Islamic law. The bulk of the Quran consists of broad, general, moral directives or principles, and this is the first source of law. Remember, the Quran is the book of God, the revelation. Approximately 80 prescriptions in the Quran rank as legal prescriptions in the very narrowest sense or definition of law. In other senses, you're talking about legal principles and values. And most of these come from the Medinan period, when Muhammad was establishing the first Islamic community state. The second source of law is the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet. Remember, we talked about how the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are the foundation stones. The Prophet's Sunnah, what he said and did, which were believed to be preserved in narrative stories and reports known as traditions of the Prophet, hadith. The third source is analogical reasoning, or qiyas. It's a technique used when no clear text of the Quran or the Sunnah is directly relevant to a legal question. And so when there's no clear text that exists, then jurists were free to use their independent judgment or reasoning, called ijtihad, to examine similar situations whose principles could be applied to this new situation. This, of course, led to a great deal of diversity of opinion. The fourth source of law is the consensus, the ijma' of the community. In practice, it came to be understood as the consensus of the majority of scholars, religious scholars, the ulama, who were the guardians and interpreters of the law. In many ways, the self-proclaimed guardians and interpreters. This source originated from a tradition of the Prophet that said, my community will never agree on an error. Now, while that tradition of the Prophet was referring to the Ummah, the community in general, as I said, over time it came to be understood as the ulama, as in speaking for the community, the representatives of the community, because they were the knowledgeable ones. They knew the religious sources. Concern for justice led to the development of other subsidiary legal principles. Among them were equity, which permits exceptions to a strict or literal legal reasoning in favor of public interest, another source, public interest or human welfare, the general welfare, assuring a flexibility that enabled judges to arrive at just and equitable decisions. Now, Shi'i Muslims have a somewhat different set of legal sources. And most importantly, within this context, we need to note that they accept, yes, the Quran and the Sunnah, but also their own collections of the traditions of Ali and his successors as Imam. Remember in Shi'ism the importance of Ali and the Imams, whom they regard as supreme authorities and legal interpreters. Now, while there is a unity, an overall unity within Islamic law, it's important to note there's also a diversity. Islamic law is both a source of unity as well as difference and diversity. While the four schools of law agree in their essentials, they differ in a number of particulars, reflecting the role of individual reasoning and social custom. There'll be differences about the qualifications in terms of who you can marry, or areas that have to do with the maintenance of a wife, how much maintenance and for how long. This will vary from school to school. Individual jurists differ in their interpretation of texts. They, after all, we're using their human reason, their personal opinions, their notions of equity and public welfare. So too the diverse social backgrounds and cultural context of legal scholars. The technical term for legal scholars here is a faqih, the plural a fuqaha, to refer to the jurist or the legal scholar. That also affected their judgments and informed their interpretations. What was their social context? What was the cultural context? Thus, law schools differed about the grounds on which a woman could sue for divorce or an amount to be paid for maintenance. The differences in local customs of the more cosmopolitan and class-conscious city of Kufa, a Hanafi center, versus the more conservative Medina, where the Maliki law school developed, can be seen in the varying regulations of these law schools. A similar diversity is illustrated by the official legal opinions or interpretations, what are called fatwas. A fatwa is a legal opinion rendered by an expert, a consultant, a mufti. And we see these terms emerging more in our media. The mufti is one who advises judges and advises litigants. It's a bit like in a law case today where either the plaintiff, the defendant, might go to a prominent legal scholar at a major law school to get an opinion and then bring that to court and use that before the court. We see these differences among muftis or legal scholars and differences therefore in their fatwas in recent times, when muftis have provided contrasting opinions or fatwas in the Salman Rushdie case, for example, and in the Gulf War of 1991. The Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa found Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, guilty of blasphemy, and he was condemned to death. That resulted, as many of you will recall, in his going into hiding. Now, other muftis, while deploring the book, called for his trial by Islamic law, and so that difference in approach. In the Gulf War, muftis' opinions varied in providing, on the one hand, supporting positions for Iraq, or on the other, support for the U.S.-led Armada that included Arab and Muslim countries, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Similar differences of opinion have been seen more recently regarding the issue of suicide bombing and martyrdom, most particularly in Palestine, Israel today, and in that conflict. Now, a major area of Islamic law, and one that we need to mention both here and later on when we deal with the issue of women, that is in the class that we'll have on women, is Muslim family law. Because of the centrality of the community in Islam, the Muslim family as the basic unit of society enjoyed pride of place in the development and implementation of Islamic law. Muslim family law includes three major areas: marriage, divorce, and inheritance. While rulers in early Islam and today might limit, circumvent, or replace other areas of law, penal and commercial laws, for example, Muslim family law has generally remained in force. The formulation of Muslim family law has been subject to reform and widespread debate and revision since the 20th century, and we certainly see it today in the 21st century. The place of women in family law reform remains, therefore, an important, extremely sensitive, and hotly contested issue in Islam and in Muslim societies. The status of women and the family in Islamic law was the product of Arab culture, Quranic reforms, and foreign ideas and values assimilated from conquered people. The Quran introduced substantial reforms, providing new regulations and modifying local custom and practice. At the same time, much of the traditional pre-Islamic social structure and its extended family and the paramount position of males in a patriarchal society, I want to underscore the importance of patriarchal society, was incorporated. Marriage and family life are the expected norm in Islam. In contrast to Christianity, in Islam, marriage is not a sacrament but a contract between a man and a woman, or perhaps more accurately, between their families. In the traditional practice of arranged marriages, the families or guardians, not the bride and groom, are the two primary actors. The Quran introduced a number of reforms that enhanced the status of women. It recognized, for example, a woman's right to contract her own marriage and receive the dower from her husband in chapter 4, verse 4. Thus she became a party to the contract, not just an object for sale. In a society where no limitations on polygamy existed, the Quran sought to control and regulate polygamy, stipulating that a man could marry up to 4 wives, provided he could support and treat them equally. It's important to note here that the Quran did not require that a man marry 4 wives, but limited him to that number. The relationship between a husband and a wife in Islamic law is viewed as complementary, reflecting their differing characteristics, capacities, and dispositions, as well as the traditional roles of men and women, again, in the patriarchal family. The primary arena for the man is the public sphere. He's to support and protect the family. Women's primary role is that of wife and mother, managing the household, supervising the upbringing and religious training of their children. While both are equal before God and equally required to lead virtuous lives, in family matters and society, women were subordinate because of their more sheltered and protected lives and their dependency on men who had greater economic responsibilities in the extended family. Now, while divorce is permissible, both the Quran and the prophetic traditions underscore its seriousness. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Of all the permitted things, divorce is the most abominable with God." And an authoritative legal manual describes divorce as a dangerous and disapproved procedure as it dissolves marriage. In Arab society, men could divorce at will and on whim, and women had no grounds for divorce. The Quran and Islamic law introduced guidelines based on greater equity and responsibility to constrain a man's unbridled right to divorce and to establish a woman's right to a judicial court divorce. However, these laws were often compromised by social realities and circumvented. Thus, for example, a husband was required by law to pronounce the formula for divorce, "I divorce you," 3 times, once each month, for a period of 3 months, during which a time for reconciliation was to be pursued. In fact, some men bypassed the Quranically mandated 3-month waiting period, which is found in the Quran, chapter 65, verse 1, by saying, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you," 3 times all at one time. Now, while Islamic law considered such an act unapproved or deviant, it was nevertheless legally valid. The force of patriarchy was especially evident in the requirement that women, in contrast to men, go before a court and present grounds to obtain a divorce. Patriarchy also governed the rules of inheritance in pre-Islamic Arabia, according to which all property passed to the nearest male relative of the deceased. In contrast, the Quran gave rights to wives, daughters, sisters, and grandmothers of the deceased, guaranteeing them a fixed share before the inheritance, the remainder of the inheritance, could pass to the senior male. Men still inherited more than women, a fact that reflected gender relations in a male-dominated society, as well as a male's greater economic responsibilities. In practice, however, Quranic and legal reforms were often circumvented by families whose women were either ignorant of their rights or intimidated into not pursuing them. With the creation of modern nation-states in the 20th century, many Muslim governments implemented Western-inspired legal codes. However, family law was subject to reform rather than replacement. Among the key areas of concern were marriage, polygamy and child marriages, divorce and inheritance. This process of reform often set in motion a struggle between governments and their Western-oriented elite, who legislated or imposed change from above, and the ulama, religious scholars, who saw themselves as the defenders of the tradition of Islam and as the only qualified interpreters. Reforms raised the minimum age for marriage, requiring that men obtain permission from a court to take a second wife or to divorce, and expanded the grounds for women to obtain a divorce. Faced with resistance to legal reforms, governments did not pursue systematic reform, and compromises were made. Often the penalties, fines, and imprisonment for failure to comply with the law were minimal, were relatively light. The force of religious tradition could be seen in the fact that failure to comply with reform laws rendered an act illegal but not invalid, since few governments were willing to replace Islamic law and be accused of abrogating Sharia or God's law. Thus, if a man took another wife, his second marriage would be illegal and his progeny illegitimate in the eyes of the law, but not invalid in the eyes of God, according to many Islamic jurists. The tenuousness of family law reforms became evident in Muslim countries such as Iran and Pakistan in recent decades, as conservative ulama and Islamic movements pressed for their repeal. More fundamentalist and conservative voices reject reforms as un-Islamic and motivated by Western-oriented elites. They continue to pose a major obstacle to substantive reforms. However, the momentum today for greater gender equality and the growing empowerment of women have increased pressure for and debate over substantive reform in many Muslim societies. Now we move or shift from the exterior path to the interior path, Sufism or mysticism. Like Islamic law, Sufism or Islamic mysticism began as a reform movement in the Umayyad Empire. Sufis found the emphasis on this life, in contrast to the next, on power and wealth, on Islam as a system of laws and rules, to be spiritually lacking. In contrast to the exterior path of law and duty, they emphasized the more interior path of piety and devotional love. These early Sufis or mystics were motivated by a desire to return to what they regarded as the purity and simplicity of the time of Muhammad, that led them to seek direct and personal experience now of God in this world. They pursued an ascetic lifestyle that emphasized detachment from the material world, repentance for sins, and focus on the Last Judgment. This ascetic lifestyle was symbolized by their wearing of a simple, coarse, woolen garment. Early Sufis dedicated themselves to a life of prayer, fasting, meditation on the Quran, and imitation of Muhammad. The early mystics typify the concerns and spirit of Sufism. Hassan al-Basri, who lived from 643 to 728, an eminent scholar, typifies the ascetic reaction to the extravagances, what he considered to be the decadence of imperial Islam. Thus he declared, "The lower material world is a house whose inmates labor for loss, and only abstention from it makes one happy in it. He who befriends it in desire and love for it will be made wretched by it, and his portion with God will be laid waste. For this world has neither worth nor weight with God, so slight it is. Both men and women participated in Sufism. Emphasis on ascetic detachment or renunciation of dependence on the material world was complemented by the contribution of Rabia al-Adawiyya, who died in 801, who fused asceticism with an undying devotional love of God. This combination of the ascetic with the ecstatic would permanently influence the future development of Sufism. An attractive and desirable woman, she declined all offers of marriage, not permitting anyone or anything to distract her from total dedication and commitment to God. The following words attributed to Rabia capture her selfless love and devotion. "O my Lord, if I worship you out of fear of hell, and if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from it. But if I worship you for your own sake, then withhold not from me your eternal beauty." The spread of Sufism led to the absorption of outside influences from the new areas to which Sufism spread, from Africa to Southeast Asia. Sufism adopted and adapted a variety of mystical doctrines, ranging from the sober to the intoxicated. Because of its adoption of external un-Islamic influences, Sufis came to be in conflict often with the more orthodox, legal-oriented, legal-minded ulama or religious scholars. Their conflicts revolved around issues of authority and power. The ulama typically sought to apply the letter of the law, while Sufis were more concerned with the spirit of the law. The majority of the ulama dismissed Sufi doctrine and practice as heretical deviation from orthodoxy. Many Sufis were persecuted and even executed as a result. A prominent theologian emerged to save the day, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. He synthesized and reconciled these diverse religious and philosophical currents of his day. Trained in law, theology, and philosophy, he responded to the major theological and philosophical challenges of his times. However, his brilliant career was cut short by a spiritual and psychological breakdown. In the midst of this spiritual crisis, al-Ghazali turned to Sufism, tempering reason and law with Sufism's emphasis on religious experience and love of God. The results were captured in what many consider to be his greatest work, the revivification of the religious sciences, which synthesized law, theology, and mysticism. Law and theology were presented in terms that were acceptable to the ulama, but were grounded in direct religious experience and interior devotion. Al-Ghazali's work led to his recognition as one of Islam's greatest scholars and earned him the title of the Renewer of Islam, a title which is reserved for one individual in each century for their work in revitalizing Islam. Now, Sufi orders emerged also around the 12th century, and it is the 12th century which proved to be a turning point, both because of al-Ghazali's legitimation of Sufism and the emergence of these orders or brotherhoods that transformed Sufism into a popular mass movement, cutting across social classes and educational backgrounds. Sufism grew now beyond its more urban elite roots. Its loose voluntary groups or associations that had met in mosques or private homes were replaced now by organized brotherhoods or religious orders, tariqas, with their own distinctive institutions and international networks. By the 13th century, brotherhoods had created international networks of centers or monasteries, zawiyas, that transformed Sufism into a mass movement, whose preachers were the great missionaries of Islam. Mystics, not the military, spread the faith from Africa to Southeast Asia. Sufism became integral and pervasive to popular religious practice and spirituality in Islam. Sufi spiritual leaders or masters, sheikhs or pirs, enjoyed great religious influence, authority, and power, both spiritual and material. Sufi monasteries or compounds served as spiritual, social, educational, and cultural centers. Their buildings and services included the master's residence, living quarters, a mosque, school, hospice, soup kitchen to feed the poor, a clinic to care for the sick. Many of the characteristics, though, of Sufism find similar experiences in Christianity and other faiths. Sufi orders or brotherhoods formed with centers or monasteries. The investiture of initiates or disciples included distinctive garb of the order, a discipline of body and mind. Sufis recited a litany of God's names and attributes, counting them on a string of beads similar to a rosary. The founders of Sufi orders often came to be venerated as saints. Their tombs became sites for pilgrimage and even miracles. Their birth or death commemorated and celebrated. In contrast to more austere interpretations of Islam, some Sufis used music and song as well as dance and bodily movements. The followers of great Sufi mystics, Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who died in 1273, the whirling dervishes, are a prime example, and they exist down to today. Popular Sufism at times did slip into magic and superstition, as well as withdrawal from the world. Some of the major Islamic revival or reform movements of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries sought to eliminate these superstitious practices. And it indeed are these practices and the reaction to them that we will look at when we turn to the rise of Islamic revivalist movements in the 17th and 18th century and look at Islamic modernist movements in the 19th and 20th century, and indeed other reform movements existing down to the 21st century.